We're good.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to class 9 called Leaving Mother Russia. Now, for the generation born in the Soviet Union after World War II, almost nothing existed outside communism. From school to the media to the arts, all education was directed by the state with the aim of teaching that man is exclusively a byproduct of social forces. By the 1960s, little of Jewish substance remained in the Soviet Union. Jewishness was a negative identity, a reminder that there were certain universities you could not attend, certain jobs you could not hope to get, and for many Jews, a very limited future. I want to talk about Rumbuli. Rumbuli is a forest site about 7.5 miles southeast of Riga, Latvia. It's a site where about 25,000 Jews were murdered by the Nazi Einsatzgruppen and local Latvian collaborators in 2 days, November 30th and December 8th, 1941. In 1963, a small group of young Riga Jews began gathering every Sunday at this forest site. They would take a bus from downtown Riga and travel out to the forest area. Their objective was to clean up the site and make it into a proper memorial ground. They placed a memorial plaque with an inscription in Yiddish on a pine tree in the Rumbula forest and a large-size poster by artist Joseph Kuskowski. Both the memorial plaque and the poster were removed in 1964, less than a year after they put it up. But the project marked the beginning of an underground Zionist movement in Riga and Moscow. So when we talk about the Refuseniks and Soviet Jewry movement, many historians believe that this is where it started. Let's talk about samizdat, from the Russian word self-publishing. The samizdat was a form where secret typewriters and carbon paper and distributed by hand. Now, in the Soviet Union, possession of banned literature was grounds for arrest at this time. And the samizdat movement was not only with Soviet Jews, it was with Russian dissidents also. But remember, this is before the internet. And when you think about the technology involved, here you are copying articles and entire books on often borrowed typewriters with pieces of carbon paper in between the pages. So you could make 2, 3, or 4 copies at a time. And you had no way to get them out except by hand, by handing them to somebody. Now, the sources for Jewish samizdat included private libraries from before the war, the Israeli embassy in Moscow, and tourists. There were older dissident Jews, including people who had been sent to Siberia, who came back in the 50s and 60s, and had private libraries with Jewish books. Also, the Israeli embassy in Moscow was very active in handing out articles, magazines, and even phonograph records of Hebrew songs. And of course, tourists. Now I'm going to go into the tourist aspect of the samizdat later on, because in 19 the winter of 1969, 1970, I made a trip to the Soviet Union. And in my small way, I participated in that movement. Now, what was the most popular article, book, or artifact in the Jewish Samizdat? Does anybody know off the top of their heads? It was Leon Uris's Exodus, which had come out in 1958. Remember, it was in English, a language that most Jews, or most people in the Soviet Union did not speak, study, or have access to. But it was widely copied, and those who could speak English would translate
between 11 and 11.
Would translate Exodus into Russian. And basically, Exodus gave the Zionist movement a heroic and romantic color. How many of you read, can I see a show of hands, how many of you read Exodus, the book, the novel? Okay, so did I. And I remember at the time, yes, it was very heroic. This is before even Paul Newman starred in the leading role in the movie. In 1966, Andrei Snyavsky and Yuli Daniel, two Jewish writers who tried to evade Soviet censorship by sending their works abroad, are put on trial in the Soviet Union. They were Jewish dissidents, and they were sentenced to 7 and 5 years respectively. And the harsh sentences sparked a public protest, both in Western Europe and in the Soviet Union. And this was the first time that many Soviet Jews realized that there was a movement, that it extended much wider than Soviet Jews realized. In June 1967, a historic turning point occurred, the Six-Day War. Now, the victory of Israel over a coalition of Arab states in the Six-Day War struck a very responsive chord with Jews in the Soviet Union. Remember that the USSR supplied the Arabs with weapons in the 67 war. And the Jews, as Jews were by the Arab forces, it would be the Jewish state. And the victory of the Six-Day War by Jews here in this country and in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union severed its diplomatic ties with Israel and launched an anti-Zionist, anti-Israeli campaign in their media, which, among other things, accused Jews and Israelis of anti-Soviet propaganda and even compared the Israelis to Nazis. Small Zionist groups started ulpanim, Hebrew language classes, and the Samizdat movement took off, including translated copies of Exodus and Zev Jabotinsky's writings in Leningrad, Moscow, and Riga. I included a famous text that was copied and widely distributed in the Soviet Union among the Jews at the time. Boris Kushubievsky's Why Am I a Zionist? He wrote, I am a Jew. I want to live in a Jewish state. That is my right, just as it is the right of a Ukrainian to live in the Ukraine, the right of a Russian to live in Russia, the right of a Georgian to live in Georgia. I want to live in Israel. That is my dream. That is the goal, not only of my life, but also of the lives of hundreds of generations that preceded me, of my ancestors who were expelled from their land. I want my children to study in the Hebrew language. I want to read Jewish papers. I want to attend a Jewish theater. What's wrong with that? What is my crime? Now, this manifesto was incredibly radical for that point in time in the Soviet Union for several reasons. First of all, because it went totally against formal Soviet propaganda, the media, and education. The Soviet Union was engaged in the Cold War, remember? And it was the center of the communist movement. It was a worker's paradise. Who would not want to, if they had a choice, live in the Soviet Union? And who would want to publicly say that they desired not to live in the Soviet Union, but to live somewhere else, let alone a Jewish state? In 1968, the invasion of Czechoslovakia changed the movement once again. In Czechoslovakia, Alexander Dubček took over leadership in January of 1968. He offered a program of reforms, including freedom of speech and religion, the abolition of censorship, an end to restrictions on travel, major industrial and agricultural reforms. Now think about this program. This is in a Soviet satellite in Czechoslovakia. What effect would this have on people in the Soviet Union? Well, if this were allowed to proceed, there would probably be many people in the Soviet Union that would say, why can't we have these reforms in our workers' paradise? Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev warned Dubček to halt his reforms. Dubček didn't, and he talked about a program of socialism with a human face. August 20th, nearly 200,000 Soviet, East German, Polish, Hungarian, and Bulgarian troops invaded Czechoslovakia in the largest deployment of military force in Europe since the end of World War II. There were several outcomes of this invasion of Czechoslovakia. First of all, in Czechoslovakia itself, there was no true armed resistance. At the same time, there was no major international action taken by the West. Placed by hardliners announced that they were willing to follow the Soviet line. Dubček himself was later expelled from the Communist Party and made a forest inspector based in Bratislava. There was also increased repression of any cultural heterodoxy in the USSR, and the Jewish sense of alienation was intensified. Around the same time, a number of Jews were put on trial in a series of high-profile court cases. They include the May 1969 Kiev trial of Boris Koshubeyevsky, who was sentenced to a labor camp for his openly Zionist beliefs. In December 1970, the first Leningrad trial took place. 11 defendants, all but one of them Jewish, were accused of planning to hijack a plane to fly from Leningrad to Sweden. Two of these people, Mark Dimschitz and Edward Kuznetsov, are sentenced to death. Their sentences are later commuted to terms in a labor camp. Other trials included the second Leningrad and Riga trials, both in May 1971, involving Jewish activists from those cities. So one question to ask is, did these folks from Leningrad really intend to hijack the plane and fly it from Leningrad to Sweden? And what did they hope to accomplish? Historians later on, interviewing Dimshits, believe that yes, indeed, he did intend to actually carry out the plot. And his rationale was, if it succeeded, they would be able to leave the Soviet Union. If it didn't succeed, it would give publicity and spark a movement of Jews in the Soviet Union who wanted to leave. And that it did. That was really the beginning of the Refusnik movement as a widespread movement among Soviet Jews. Now, what is a Refusnik? It's a Jew who applied to leave the Soviet Union for Israel and was refused permission to emigrate. Remember, emigration was not allowed by anyone. It wasn't just Jews couldn't leave. It was a crime to apply to leave the Soviet Union. In order to leave and emigrate, you had to apply to OVIR, O-V-I-R. And I'm sorry, I don't know what that is in Russian, but that was the Office of Immigration. So you made a formal application to leave the Soviet Union. Well, once you did and applied for that exit visa, most of the time you were refused. And then you became put on a list. You were harassed by the KGB, dismissed from work, demoted to a junior level or a menial job. Often you lost your apartment. You suffered from the discomfort and hate to which families, particularly their children, were subjected. Now, if you applied to leave the Soviet Union, you did not know how long it would take, if ever, that you'd be granted an exit visa. And if you applied and you lost your job, and in many cases your place where you resided, you could be arrested for being a social parasite. Remember I talked about the trial in the last class. I'm blanking.
Mendel Bayless.
Who was accused of being a parasite. No. Joseph Brodsky, the poet, in the last class. And he was accused of being a social parasite. So if you didn't work in the Soviet Union, you were accused of being a parasite. And if you applied for an exit visa, you lost your job. You could be arrested and put in jail for being a social parasite. Now, what would you do with all this time that you had? Well, one thing that the Refusniks did was they started group studies, adult education classes. Mainly, they consisted of small, organized language circles. They studied Hebrew, also Jewish history and culture. And these small study groups mushroomed in a number of cities towards the end of the 1960s. It also was a time that a real movement began to be built among Jews in the Soviet Union. And the skeleton of an organization with new leaders. Many of these new leaders were intellectuals and scientists. Some eminent scientists in their fields. Now, one thing about being a scientist in the Soviet Union is that sometimes you were allowed even to travel abroad, but generally you were allowed to express your opinion publicly. And you often had foreign contacts. Now, because many of these leaders had professional achievements in the face of discrimination, It proved their stamina and determination, and they now applied their skills to exploiting the new circumstances to the. For example, a number of scientists conducted seminars to enable them to keep up with the latest scientific developments. This led to increased harassment from the Soviet government. Telephones were disconnected, foreign mail was intercepted, and organizers of these seminars were arrested. In addition to scientific material, seminars also to Jewish culture and history. Now, although mainstream refuseniks remained secular, they were attracted by Jewish tradition, especially by Jewish holidays and festivals. Jewish history and the Bible were other important subjects because they were perceived not through a religious perspective, but as the basis of the Jewish national tradition. And they became more relevant to Soviet Jews in their current situation than Russian culture, a culture that frequently reflected and underscored their humiliation and discrimination. I want to give you a little personal recollection. In 1969, 1970, in December and January of that year, I participated in a university student trip to the Soviet Union. Now, before I left, I had made contact with the Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry, one of the major groups working here in the United States in the Soviet Jewry movement. They had lists of refuseniks, telephone numbers even. And I visited their New York office before we flew by plane to the Soviet Union and asked for addresses of refuseniks that I could meet and lists of items that I could bring with me to give them, because a lot of them, the only way they were able to make any money and support themselves is through black market activities. Tourists would bring them books, religious articles, but what's really important were blue jeans. Why blue jeans? Anybody figure that out?
Because they were well sought after and could command a very good price.
Exactly, on the black market. Exactly. And I don't really remember exactly how much, but blue jeans were selling for anywhere between $50 to $150 a pair, depending on who was selling them and who was buying them. So I filled an entire suitcase with blue jeans instead of clothing and brought it with me. And one thing, meeting with Soviet refuseniks, on the student trip that I took, two of my roommates at the time were former Navy, non-Jewish, were former members of the Navy, and spoke fluent Russian because they had been put through school to learn Russian, and they had worked on a submarine. And their job in the Navy was basically to sit for 8 to 10 hours a day with earphones on and listen in Russian to messages passed between Soviet ships and Soviet submarines. So they spoke Russian fluently, and they would often go with me because I had the contacts, and they were able to meet refuseniks. Now, at that point, when you went to the Soviet Union on a student trip, you really didn't have much of an opportunity to meet a typical Russian people. Everywhere you went as a group on these trips, and you were shepherded around. They were tour guides, but they worked for the government. to make sure that you went to places, you went to the official places that you were supposed to go. You didn't pass out literature. You didn't pass out blue jeans. But every morning after breakfast, for the first week of the trip, I would take off with one of my two roommates who spoke Russian, and we would go to an address in the city, to an apartment where we would meet and bring them company, letting them know what was going on outside the Soviet Union, a meeting with them. And it was an amazing opportunity to meet these people. Now, remember, this is the middle of the winter. And we'd go to these apartments, and we were always welcomed when we went inside. Most of them had samovars. You know what a samovar is, don't you, folks? Most of them had samovars and would make us hot tea. And they'd open up the cabinets in their kitchens and take out everything that was in the cabinets. Anything that you could possibly eat, they would take out and offer us. And we'd sit and talk, just what life was like, and exchange stories and exchange views. I had a camera and a cassette recorder that I would record our conversations. And most of the refuseniks that I visited spoke English, okay? So I could record the conversations that we had because they were in English. Some spoke English much better than others, of course. Well, after the first week, I had come back after meeting with one of the refusenik families in the morning. And I put my cassette recorder and my camera in our hotel room, and we went down to lunch. And I came back after lunch to the room, and guess what was missing? The camera and the cassette recorder. Now, this did not happen without somebody knowing what was going on, because every floor in hotels where foreigners stayed in the Soviet Union, there was a babushka, an old woman who sat in the hall and monitored everyone who came and went. So nobody could come and go without her knowing. And I went to my professor who led the student trip and told him that the camera and the cassette recorder were missing. And he said, this is what we need to do. We need to go to the Soviet police station and file an official report, which we did. And the inspector who took the report said, equipment, you leave back to the United States. So after we left the police station, I asked my professor, how can they be so sure that they're going to catch the thieves? And he smiled and said, don't worry, they will. The day before we were supposed to leave back to the United States, guess what? Someone from the police turned up at our hotel with the camera, with the cassette machine. All the cassettes were erased. All the film had been removed from the cameras, from my camera. So I had no record to bring back with me. But such was the efficiency of the Soviet police force at the time. In 1974, in the United States, the Jackson-Vanik Amendment was passed. Now, this linked most favored nation trading status for non-market economy countries with liberalized immigration policies. And the Soviet Union gained most favored trading status, but they had to liberalize the whole process of emigration from the Soviet Union. The Jackson-Vanik Amendment, along with the Helsinki Accords in 1978, which stated all signatories will abide by the Charter of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, emphasized the right of citizens to emigrate. Now, for the most part, neither the policy of refusing exit permits to Jewish immigrants nor the dubious criteria for doing so changed substantially over the years. Even after the passing of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, emigration did not jump, at least for the first year. But a year afterwards, between 1975, 1978, and 1979, there was an unprecedented rise in the number of Soviet Jews who were allowed to emigrate. That shrank once more in the 1980s when it became increasingly difficult to obtain exit permits. And the composition of the refusnik community changed radically once the majority sought to leave for the West rather than Israel. That is during 1976 and 1977. Before 1976, almost everyone who wanted to emigrate from the Soviet Union wanted to go to Israel. But after 1976, that changed as there began to be dropouts. What happened was Soviet Jews would receive an exit permit. This would allow them to fly from Moscow or Leningrad or Riga to Vienna, which became the center of processing for Soviet Jewish immigrants. Now, up until 1976, almost all of the immigrants chose to go from Vienna to Israel. But after 1976, an increasing number of immigrants said, no, we want to come to the United States or Canada. There were several reasons for that. One was because there was a distinct difference in the ideology of the earlier refusniks, who were Zionist, very pro-Zionist, and the reason they wanted to immigrate was come to Israel. When it became easier to emigrate, other Jews in the Soviet Union said, we want to emigrate because we do not see a future for our children. We do not see a future for us as Jews, because so many of the jobs and possibilities were closed to Jews. But we want to get the heck out of the Soviet Union and go to the West rather than Israel because we're not committed ideological Zionists. The percentages of those who chose to go West rather than Israel exceeded for the first time 50% in 1977 and actually comprised the majority up until 1989. In the 1980s were simply Jews with Jewish national home. In the 1980s, the number of refusniks was far larger than in the previous decade. But it still was not a huge number. At least until 1979, there were probably never more than 2,000 refusniks at any given moment. By 1986, there were 2 or 3 times as many, and according to some accounts, 10,000 refusniks per year who filed to leave the Soviet Union. In the 1980s, Jewish emigration began to slow for a number of reasons. These included the increasingly conservative policies of the aging Soviet administration. Because of the stagnating economy, the government couldn't afford to lose so many qualified people. So they clamped down on immigration. At the same time, immigration was no longer serving as a bargaining tool in Soviet-American relations. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union. The first year of his regime did not bring a marked change in the policy towards Jewish population or emigration. And at the same time, as part of his policy of glasnost, or openness towards the West, all citizens in the Soviet Union gradually obtained more freedom to practice their culture and religion. The outcome of this was the Jewish community in the Soviet Union experienced a cultural revival that continued throughout the late 1980s and 1990. In 1990 and 91, emigration again became the main focus of Jewish activity. Now, this change was a consequence of several factors. One was the failure of Gorbachev's reforms. Although people in the Soviet Union had high hopes that reform would make a difference in the economic situation of the people in the Soviet Union, that didn't play out in reality. Also, liberalization, or glasnost, gave greater scope to radical and nationalist currents, such as Pamayat. It's an extreme nationalist right-wing Russian political movement. And they had been unable to surface under the Soviet system. But they began surfacing in the early 1990s. There also was an increasingly acute economic crisis that led ultimately to the disintegration of the Soviet state. Between late 1989 and the ultimate fall of the Soviet Union, anywhere between 367,000 to some 380,000 Jews departed. In 1992, as previously agreed upon by Mikhail Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. The bottom line, as we're going to see in our last class in the Soviet Union, was that Jews had no official status anymore as a collective. And discrimination against Jews became discrimination against Jews as individuals. And in this way, all the achievements of the refuseniks notwithstanding, they basically remained the aliens they had been under the Tsars. Does anybody have any questions, comments?
I just wanted to mention one little piece of personal history. Between 1976 and 1980, I was working in Baton Rouge. And in 1977, the Jewish community, which was all of about 1,000 people, sponsored 4 families coming to Baton Rouge, of all places, because of their engineering backgrounds. They fit in perfectly, and for the most part, did very well. And I just thought that was remarkable.
Especially to Baton Rouge. You know, in Brit Shalom, we had a very active Soviet Jewry movement, thanks to Joyce Gilbert. Joyce Gilbert was very active here in Houston, but also she directed the Houston Action for Soviet Jewry, but she also served as a vice president of the Union of Councils for Soviet Jews nationally. And she has a lot of stories to tell about the Soviet Jewry movement nationally and in her efforts to bring Soviet Jews here to Houston. And I don't know what the final number of Soviet Jews who came to Houston is, but quite a few thousand Jews came here to Houston as a result of her effort and the efforts of the Houston Action for Soviet Jews here in this city. Any other comments?
Yes, can you hear me, Howard?
Yes,
Aaron?
Leah.
Hi, Aaron. Okay, this has been really extremely interesting, and I thank you. But there's so much information, and I wish I could have all this in writing. Is there any way to get it in writing, your lectures?
Jennifer,
Yes, absolutely.
Hi,
Yeah,
Jennifer.
hi.
Hi.
We do have all of his handouts are on the website, so I will send you an email with those links so that you can take a look at the handouts that he's talking from.
Right, and then I can print it up.
You can. I'll send it to
Wow,
you.
this is a treat, and I thank you. This has been so interesting.
well, I
Thank
thank
you.
you. I thank you all for joining us. And next week is going to be, unfortunately, our last class. I say that unfortunately because it's been such a pleasure to be with all of you. And I thank all of you for joining us for lo these many weeks. One more thing. I told Jennifer before the class began that when we started 9 weeks ago, I wasn't sure that we'd still be doing this online after 10 weeks because I wasn't sure how all this was going to play out. But looking at how it's playing out, we could probably do it for another 10 weeks if I had a curriculum to offer to you.
It's beautiful.
Jennifer, thanks once again for helping out.
Absolutely.
Thanks everybody for joining us. I appreciate it. Be well, everyone.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
We'll see everyone
Thank
next
you.
week. Have a great week.
See you next
Thank
week.
you.
folks.